Okay, well, why don't we get this going, and then as people join, they can get caught up. How's it sound? Y'all ready?
That sounds great. Let's
Great.
do this.
Okay, well, my name is Kelsey Hensey. I am the founder and editor-in-chief at Fathom Mag, and we are so excited that y'all have come here tonight or later, if you're watching this, that you watched it on YouTube, to hear this conversation. I actually was unfamiliar with this book until we started talking about this, and I read it, and I know it's really sad. You should shake your head at me.
But you read it, so we won.
That's great. Yeah, I did read
That's
it.
why we did this whole thing. It was
It's already a success. That's
Yep.
all I'm hearing.
Let's go home.
Okay, it was great. Well, I found the book remarkable and loved it. And I'm so glad we're having this conversation, particularly with two people that know clearly much more about it than I do, since I only just recently finished it. So this is going to be a lot of fun. Our two experts that are not me tonight are Alan Noble. He is the editor-in-chief of Christ in Pop Culture. So if you haven't been over there, you should definitely check that out. They do some excellent work. And then he's also the associate professor of English at Oklahoma Baptist University. I've been to OBU a couple times, actually.
What?
Yeah, I'm from Northwest Arkansas originally.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, makes
Cool.
sense. Yeah,
it does.
And then he's also the author of a couple books. One, Disruptive Witness, that's been out for a little while, and an upcoming book, You Are Not Your Own. You can pre-order, and you should. All early indicators are that it's going to be excellent, and that's exactly what I'm expecting. I think it's probably going to be great. So y'all should also pre-order that book. And he's also on the leadership council of the AND campaign. So really, you just do all the things. You freelance write for places like the Atlantic Online. How do you do it all? Nobody knows.
I feel very tired.
Yeah, tired is a good way to do it all. Just a little exhausted. Yeah, that's good. And then our other expert is Joel Hing-Hartsey, who's a senior lecturer in the Faculty of Education. Do I remember that correctly? At Simon Fraser University. And he is also a music critic. So he doesn't just teach in the education department. He talks a lot about music. Places like Christianity Today, Paste, Relevant have all published articles by him. And honestly, that list just goes on and on. Seattle Weekly, all of these places. So you should look for him not only in the J.D. Salinger department, but in all the things that sound great to you music-wise. So he's also an author, does all the things as well. So 3 books that I'm aware of, maybe there's more. Sex, Love, and Rock and Roll. That's SECTS, in case any of y'all were confused.
I'm so sorry about the title of that book.
Are you though?
Yeah,
Are you though?
I think you just purposely put everybody in that position. You knew that was going to happen. This is no surprise. And then also a book with a very different title called Teaching English at Colleges and Universities in China. And then 2 ends of the spectrum, really. And then he has a forthcoming book called Dancing About Architecture is a Reasonable Thing to Do, which of the 3 is my favorite title, if I'm picking a favorite.
Mine too.
It's excellently done, I would say. Well, I'm just going to hand it over to them and let them talk through this excellent piece of literature that we have in front of us. So, Joel, I think I'll let you take over.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kelsey, and everybody at Fathom. I'm so glad that y'all are willing to take a chance on this. As you said, it's a wonderful book. I think everybody should read it. I think that your readers will like it. And I also want to thank Alan for joining us. Alan and I first met, I think, reading each other's blogs while we were in grad school, both at California State Universities years ago. And we've kind of kept tabs on each other since, and it's been cool to see everything that he's done since then. But I've known for a long time that we share a love of J.D. Salinger, and I, like many people, sort of fell in love with Salinger when I read Catcher in the Rye in high school. At my Catholic school in Spokane, Washington, we had a teacher who was a Salinger nut, and for extra credit, he would have us go look up unpublished Salinger stories and make copies of the New Yorker, and so we could give them to him to read. As I told this story before, but when I started college, I read Franny and Zooey. And on my first day of college, I told everyone that my 3 favorite books were Franny and Zooey, The Communist Manifesto, and Mere Christianity. And I think of those 3, Franny and Zooey is the only one that I still regularly read. And it may have been a bit of posturing on my part for the others. But Alan, I'd love to know, how did you come to your interest in Salinger and your kind of appreciation for this book?
Yeah, so I had some friends when I played music who were into the same bands and a lot of the same literature, and they loved the Beats, and they loved so they loved Kerouac, and they also loved Salinger, and they told me to read Catcher in the Rye, and they told me to read. So I say Franny and Zooey.
Oh,
So
well, that's
should we even continue? I'm not.
No, let's just each to his own. Yeah.
Okay. And because it's two O's, and I don't know. And so yeah, so I read it, and I didn't get to read it in a class, and it blew my mind. Then I did get to read it in grad school. Thankfully, I had one grad professor who actually had some respect for Salinger, which wasn't always the case, because when I wanted to write on him for a chapter of my dissertation, I went to one very esteemed professor, and he said, Salinger is not a serious author, so you're going to have to find someone else to write about. I was like, cool, I guess I'll work with someone else. And so that was unfortunate, but yeah. And he said, nobody's gonna be reading him in, I don't know, however many years. But yeah, so getting to read this in grad school was very eye-opening, but this very quickly became like my comfort book. And so whenever, I don't know, things get rough, I'll often just have this on my nightstand, and I'll just read through this, and it helps a lot. It's a very comforting book.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned people not taking Salinger seriously. I remember when I don't work in literature anymore, but when I was writing about Salinger years ago, it was hard to find literary critics who would deal with his work, and even now I think it is hard. I think Eberhard Olson is still out there. He just wrote another book about Salinger this past year.
Mm.
But it grabs, Salinger's writing grabs people, and it tends to grab you when you're young. But I've found that returning to a book like this as one ages is also really rewarding. And maybe people I assume people know The Catcher in the Rye. They know it's about a misfit teenager who's trying to figure out his place in the world and fight the phonies. I think maybe not a lot of people know about The Glass Family, which is sort of Salinger's, I think, artistic obsession for most of his career.
Yeah.
Which is who this book focuses on. So could you maybe tell people, or either one of us can do it, tell people a little bit about who are these characters that Salinger really spent a lot of his career crafting?
If I remember correctly, I think the first Glass story is A Perfect Day for Banana Fish. I think he starts with that, and he kind of writes himself into a corner because the oldest the Glass family children, Seymour, spoilers, commit suicide at the end of that story. And one way to read this is as a story of PTSD. Salinger went to war. He went to Europe. He met Hemingway while he was there, which is fascinating. Hemingway was traveling around doing reporting, and he wrote Catcher in the Rye. Much of it was written in Europe while he was fighting the war. And it's interesting because Catcher in the Rye has almost no references to the war. It feels like it's just completely divorced from that world, but we know Salinger was deeply affected by it. And in his short stories, this appears. And A Perfect Day for Banana Fish is one of them. Here's a soldier, he's come back from the war, and it's obvious that he's profoundly traumatized. He's returned to this wife who is deeply materialistic and uninterested in serious things, and is complaining about being married to him. And he talks to a little girl on the beach and then gets mad at someone for staring at his feet and then kills himself. And that's the whole short story. And the way he writes himself into a corner is that as he continues to write about this Glass family, he's going to make Seymour the icon, the saint of this family. And then he sort of has to work backwards and figure out how this suicide is actually legitimate, because it traumatizes the family. It traumatizes these characters, and it traumatizes others. And by the time you get to sort of the end of his public writing with Seymour, an introduction, and Ray's Hyde, the roof beam carpenter, Seymour is he's otherworldly. I mean, he doesn't even seem like a real human being anymore. Buddy Glass, one of the younger brothers, the middle brother, is writing about his older brother and as if he were a saint. And it's a very different story. But yes, you're right, Joel. Pretty much after Catcher in the Rye, this is all Salinger wants to write, is about this one family, the Glass family.
And here's what I think is, if people might not realize, if they weren't familiar with this, or even reading some of this, is that that work is profoundly, I would say, profoundly religious, and takes the notion of faith and the quest for God extremely seriously. More so, I think some people say Salinger is maybe one of the only sort of mid 20th century American authors who really does that, which is,
Yeah.
I think, is something that makes him very much worth reading for anybody who cares about these questions, whether you're a person of faith or you have gone through, various struggles with belief. That's what these characters do, I think. And part of the trauma that you mentioned, I think, relates to having had this older brother who was sort of their model for living a good life, or a religious life, or a faithful life, but then to lose him. And I think in some ways this book is about what does it mean to try to follow in somebody's footsteps that you admire, that you look up to, but who seems to have not figured it out after all in the end. And maybe I'll just mention here. So there are two stories, right? They were written separately, published in the New Yorker. Franny comes first, and it's in the genre that Salinger sort of satirically, through Buddy, calls a rattling good story. It's a very tight, short, sort of event-based story of this young woman who is in college, who has a boyfriend who's a real blowhard, and although he does have this one very nice gesture where he accidentally kisses her coat while kissing her, and I think that's a very sweet gesture.
Yes. Yeah.
He's a jerk, but and Franny is having some type of emotional or some troubling breakdown, and she's trying to explain it to her boyfriend, and he doesn't get it at all. And the story ends with her, spoilers abound here, but the story ends with her passing out in a restaurant with, again, the boyfriend cluelessly not really realizing what's going on, and her sort of silently forming the words of this prayer, which is talked about a bit in that first story, more so in the second story, Zoe, from this book, The Way of a Pilgrim. And that prayer is what is known as the Jesus Prayer, which is an Eastern Orthodox prayer. Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy on me, a sinner. The story, I don't know if you did much research about kind of how this story was received, but my understanding was, apart from the Glass family saga, this story itself is just sort of seen as kind of the story of a young person's, trying to figure themselves out in college, I guess, which is kind of one of the things that attracted me to it. But what do you think about kind of that story on its own before we move into kind of how it connects with Zoe?
So, I teach this to English majors, and they just eat it up, because it is very much a literary person's crisis. The crisis of being so self-aware, so self-conscious, that you start to feel like everyone is just, in Caulfield's words, phony. One of the things I love about this ending, and speaking of Lane being terrible, is that after she passes out at the last page of this story, she starts coming to, and he propositions her. He's like, you know what, we should sleep together. How long has it been? He says, when was it? It was like way the hell early last month, wasn't it? So Salinger, so this was added for the book, because what happened was, when they originally published the short story, people assumed that she was pregnant. And so they interpreted everything through that lens, her stomach, her sickness, going to the bathroom, all these sorts of things. And Salinger was bothered by this when he got this response from readers. He's like, no, this is a spiritual crisis. I don't want no medical explanations. And so in order to fix it, he goes back and he makes Lane even worse than he already is, which is pretty bad. So she's passed out, and he's like, do you think we could still hook up? Because, I know you just passed out in the middle of a restaurant, but it's been a while. So that's my favorite. Like, Salinger just threw Lane under the bus. He was already bad, but he was just like, you know what? I need to fix this. Sorry, Lane, you're the worst.
I mean, how typical of Salinger being wrongly received, that no one was willing, even at that time, to think she genuinely is seeking something spiritual that she can't find.
Yeah. You mentioned that he does take a very strongly religious turn. I mean, there is God in Catcher in the Rye, but it gets stronger and stronger and stronger as his writing goes on. And in the middle, at the beginning of the Zooey section, Buddy is writing and he talks about, he jokes that it says, people are already shaking their heads over me, and any immediate further professional use on my part of the word God, except as a familiar, healthy American expletive, will be taken, or rather confirmed, as the very worst kind of name dropping. And they'll be sure that I'm going to the dogs. And so Salinger is, he's riding through Buddy and he's acknowledging, if I take this religious turn, if I treat spirituality seriously in the middle 20th century, I'm going to get, people aren't going to take me seriously. And sure enough, his reputation did decline after everything he published. But as to your first question, what do I think about the Franny section? So yeah, as an English major, I love it. But also, so there are a number of things. First of all, Lane is terrible, but he's also kind of endearing because, there's that scene where, he sits down with her at the diner and he feels good. He feels good about being seen with just the right girl at the right time, at the right place. Here it is. It's on page 10. Lane sampled his, and then he sat back briefly and looked around the room with an almost palpable sense of well-being at finding himself in the right place with an unimpeachably right-looking girl, a girl who was not only extraordinarily pretty, but so much the better, not too categorically cashmere sweater and flannel skirt. I love Salinger. He just throws these things in and expects you to know what not too cashmere sweater means, which I suppose I think is probably lost in history. So that's really pathetic. It's really pathetic, but it's also very human. And that's what I love about Lane is that, yeah, he's awful. But this is the very kind of thing that we do. We do often think about value, self-value, and the value of other people, and basically economic terms. So if this person who is very attractive is willing to be with me, I accrue some of their capital, social capital, or whatever you want to call it. And that means that I'm somebody, like I matter. That's pathetic. That's really pathetic. It's what Buddy says later is, or Zooey says later, is small, meaningless, and sad making. But or tiny, meaningless, and sad. I can't remember. But in any case, it's pathetic. But it's also really endearing. And the other thing I think is that Franny's breakdown is at its core, a desire for something real that she can feel safe about. She desires something genuinely good that she doesn't have to doubt. And that's just, I don't know, that seems like a very real human response.
Absolutely. I think, she essentially, the way I read it is she goes to college, she gets into literature and theater because she cares about these things. She loves them, wants to pursue them. But then all the people she meets, she seems to find some fault with, right? She feels that and whether it's Lane bloviating about his paper that he wrote for his graduate seminar or whatever, or Wally Campbell, who's doing an internship in France or whatever. She has this kind of disgust for kind of the normal things that people do when they're in college to kind of try to figure out who they are and what they want. And I think one of the reasons that she's, and this is borne out, I think, in both stories, one of the reasons she's so disgusted with other people is she's disgusted with the ambition and ego she sees in herself as she pursues theater. Is she starts to turn it over again in her head. Am I doing this for the right reasons, or do I just want attention? Do any of these people actually care about poetry, or do they just want to hear themselves talk? It's something we can all get caught up in, I think, when we pursue kind of creative lives or even kind of academic careers, right? So I think her plight is recognizable to a lot of people who aspire to pursue the arts or an intellectual life, which is what I think draws me to it.
any aspiration, I think, any sense of excellence. So if you think you want to pursue something with excellence, then you can, if you take this seriously, if you're introspective at all, you'll recognize that a part of you is doing it for really corrupt motives. Like your ego is in the way. So she recognizes that acting is good. She recognizes that poetry is good, or at least it can be good. But the problem is that she finds that when she pursues these things, or when she sees other people who are acclaimed as sort of the best, you know, these great poets are pursuing these things, their ego gets in the way. And it's really just about them. And so rather than seeking after some purely good action, these are a bunch of people really just expressing themselves. So here's where I think, you know, secularism and Charles Taylor becomes helpful, because I think part of her struggle is the struggle of expressive individualism, that she feels like she has to, or society's telling her she has to sort of express some sort of identity. She's got to be something. The problem with identity is that it's really easy, once you focus on identity, to start focusing on ego. And she also recognizes that egoism is bad. It's corrupt. So now she's stuck. Everyone I know who strives seriously to do good work ends up being a phony. And I don't know, Joel, if you've discovered that, but sometimes it's best not to read interviews of your favorite musical artists, because you'll realize, like, wow, this person is a jerk. And then you go through this, right?
I do those interviews. They're horribly disillusioning. It's awful.
And then you feel like Franny, right? You're just like, oh my gosh, I can't listen to you, because all I want is your music to leave a little beauty behind, and it's not. You just leave a little something.
Specifically, meeting an artist who, I mean, I shouldn't say who it is. I guess.
Don't say who it is, Beck, but like, keep going.
Going to meet this person, and you know, the interview was sort of incoherent. The person had been drinking a bit. Clearly wasn't, like, didn't have a lot of interesting things to say about their own work. And the band's manager, this is a very Franny moment to me. The band's manager, after I did the interview, said, "Hey, thanks so much for doing that article. Why don't you come hang out at the show?" And I was like, wow, they want me to come hang out at the show. So I got to the show and I'm like, "Hey, am I on the guest list?" And they're like, "Well, we don't see your name here." And I was like, well, you know, so-and-so said I should come meet the band. And I was sort of looking around and I just thought, what am I doing? Like, these people don't want to meet me, and I don't actually want to meet them. And is this what I want with my life? And I don't think I went to a rock show for about 2 years after that.
Oh my gosh, you're traumatized.
But that's the point, right? It's like, we can do this for the love of it. We can do this because we want to create or explain or understand beauty and truth and goodness and meaning. But it can also just become, hey, maybe I'll get to hang out with a cool guy for a while,
Yeah.
you know. And that's, so it's again, it's just a very relatable struggle, I think.
So I think, you know, the way you describe that, it reminds me of this desire for purity, which is very important for Salinger. I mean, in his personal life, he went to very bizarre extremes to seek purity. And, but his characters desire this too. And I think it's so, I think Salinger's fascination with children is an example of this. He sees sometimes in children a kind of innocence, a purity of heart that adults lack. And I just find that very compelling. You know, I think of Caulfield, Alden Caulfield, who, you know, goes to the museum and somebody's written the F word on the walls, and it breaks him, because he's like, my little sister is going to see this. That's how broken our world is. Our world is just filled with ugliness, and he just wants one nice thing, just one nice thing. Well, Franny's realizing that, okay, she's raised in this family that is cultured to pursue these nice things. But then when she's pursuing them, she's finding there's actually impurity within her. So now the question is, okay, how do I become pure inside? How can I become pure? Can you become pure inside? Because it's not enough to make some nice thing. It has to be genuine. It has to be sincere. And sincerity is kind of a trap, because if you start asking yourself, like, are you being authentic right now? The answer is never yes.
Well, now,
yeah. Like, what does that even mean? So, and this is, I think, what happens to her.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think we could get into how her brother ends up criticizing what she's chosen. Her attempt to break free is through discovering this book, The Way of the Pilgrim, where she learns the Jesus prayer, which she sort of is repeating to herself throughout the story, here and there. Um, what do you make of? I mean, it's, Salinger himself had a very sort of syncretic set of beliefs. He mostly followed sort of Vedanta, um, you know, Hinduism, Buddhism, these types of things. But what do you make of sort of Franny's seeking out of this particular prayer? I mean, I'll say one thing, which is that the way that it's described, or she describes it, is this notion of, so it's based on the verse from Thessalonians where Paul talks about prayer without ceasing. And the question is, how does one pray without ceasing? How does one get into a way of being where prayer is always happening, is always emanating from within you? And so the Jesus prayer is a path that she looks to, and it's said that the prayer sort of will sync up with one's heart. It's a sort of mystical, not fully explained thing. And she tries to do it, and the sense at the end of the story, Franny, is that it hasn't worked. It's only made things worse. And yet, there's some back and forth about whether it's a good thing for her to pursue this or not when we get into the second story. And I'm curious about, so maybe you could talk about your own thoughts on sort of her pursuit of this prayer, or kind of unpack for us, how does Zoe kind of come at her and critique her crisis?
So I think that what she's trying to do is this is a sort of rite of purification, that she wants to know that inside her heart is at least one pure thing. And the way to do that is to have a prayer that connects her, that unites her with God. And then she can know that that she can pursue these things, like acting in a way that is not focused on herself. She's realizing that she's obsessed with self and she hates it. She wants to get rid of herself by just focusing on this prayer. And one of the things I love about Zoe's response is that, basically he said, at one point he says, "You're storing up treasures on earth." No, I'm sorry. He says, "You're storing up treasures in heaven," but it's not any better.
What's the difference? Yeah.
Yeah. What's the difference? Like, and as as I'm fairly reformed, so I mean, this is kind of a works righteousness, right? Like, she's trying to get to this a place of righteousness by repeating her prayer, and she hopes, if I can say this enough, then I will be okay. But what that means is that she actually can't act. She can't move in the world. So when we see her, I wish my friend Seth Honey drew a great picture of this. I just took it to my office, but in his drawing of her, she's just curled up on the couch. And that's the image of her. So instead of being on the stage, projecting, being this fantastic actor, she's immobile, which, part of the premise of this little talk here is, okay, what's the application to today? How is this relevant? And I think that in inactivity, a feeling of inadequacy that is so powerful that you can no longer move, is a very common contemporary experience, because we have such pressure to craft a certain kind of identity that we feel unable to move in the world, feel unable to act, because if you act in any way, it's going to fail in some way. And so she's got to the place where she says, okay, I can almost be pure, but I just can't get off the couch. And he's criticizing her. I also love that he's in the same place that she's in. He has the very same crisis.
Yeah, in fact, he is shown at the beginning of his story to be already a TV actor. Salinger famously sort of had a love-hate relationship with movies and TV. You can tell that there's a certain amount that he aspired to have his work known earlier in his career, and there was one film made from his work, which was the short story Uncle Wiggily in Connecticut, which I can't believe that's the one they tried to make.
I have no idea why they did that.
If you've read that story, it's about it's a very tangential small part of the Glass family saga, but he was forever railing against the phoniness of TV and film. So I think it's quite I guess it doesn't surprise me that he would put Zoe make him a TV actor.
Yeah.
One of the things that's interesting about Zoe, and he's not nice. He's very rude to his mother for much of the first part of the story, which I'd like to believe it is in a loving sort of way, but I don't know. And he's quite rude, and he's quite rude to his sister. But he appears to be coming from a genuine place. And at one point, he criticizes Franny for not understanding who she's praying to, right? He says, you don't even really know who Jesus is, or if you did know who he was, you wouldn't like him. And he talks about this incident when she's 10 years old, where she decides that he says she quits Jesus and goes straight to Buddha. That's how he describes her, because she felt that Jesus was too, correct me if I'm wrong, but she felt Jesus was too focused on just humans, and
right.
he didn't love, all the animals equally, right? Anyway, we could go.
No, it's a great line. Yeah, he doesn't, he cares more about people than the sparrows, right, which he does care about. And Franny takes very great offense to these poor little sparrows. Zoe says, what I find ironic about that is that when I read that passage, I always think, especially when I'm reading it in a Christian college, I'm like, wow, this is if we were just to excerpt this part, it's a really great criticism of the way that humans try to take Jesus and make him anything but who he is in the Bible. Like, we want him to be something else. And so Franny wants him to be this animal rights activist, Jesus, who's this past, very different from who he is in the Bible. And Zoe says, no, you don't get to do that. Like, you have to wrestle with the God of the Bible. But I don't think that's actually who Zoe gives us either. So there's some irony in there, which is fine.
In any case, he does appear to be in typical sort of Glass family fashion, impugning her sincerity or her purity, I guess, right? You're pursuing this perhaps for the wrong reasons, or you think you're pursuing something that you're actually not pursuing. And the solution, if I can say that, and I think solution is an unfair word for it probably, but this all builds, sort of Zoe's critique of Franny and his telling her that she's going about the prayer wrong, and his probably accurate criticism that she's ignoring the consecrated chicken soup that her mother is offering her. There's some very sweet things about him trying to get her to recognize why their home and their family is important to who she is and her spiritual path even. But we see the kind of climax of this story in a really interesting way. So Zoe goes to his brother's bedroom, his old brother's bedroom, Buddy and Seymour, who have long since left home, but who still have a separate telephone in the house that Buddy pays for because he can't bring himself to stop paying for it. And what I've always loved about this is, so Zoe makes a call to the main line of the house and asks to speak to Franny, pretending to be Buddy, but sharing a bit of wisdom from Seymour. So it's Seymour through Buddy, through Zoe, which I think is kind of cool, and I think shows the way that these complicated family relationships and the way they pass down kind of spiritual knowledge or truth or teaching has gone. And he gives this speech that's very famous that I'd love to read if it's okay, briefly.
Do it.
I'll just read the kind of the last paragraph of it. So he sort of tells Franny, listen, you're frustrated with the audiences in your plays, and you're frustrated with your professors, and you're frustrated with the whole enterprise. But don't you remember when we were on this? So, we forgot to mention they were all the Glasses are total child prodigies and geniuses, and they're on this quiz show, right? It's a Wise Child, and for years they've been on this radio program. And Seymour always told his brothers and sisters that they needed to do it for the fat lady. It sounds silly when you say it that way. They needed to be funny for the fat lady. They needed to shine their shoes for the fat lady. And Zoe says to Franny, do you remember that? Do you ever remember? I'm going to get choked up even talking about this. Do you remember, did Seymour ever tell you that? She says, oh, yes, he did. And I had this woman in my imagination. She had cancer, and she was sitting on her porch swatting flies and listening to us on the radio. And he says to her, And is it okay if I swear on this? I don't know if that's okay. So he says to her, I don't care where an actor acts. It can be in summer stock, it can be over the radio, it can be over television, it can be in a goddamn Broadway theater, complete with the most fashionable, well-fed, sunburned-looking audience you can imagine. But I'll tell you a terrible secret. Are you listening to me? There isn't anyone out there who isn't Seymour's fat lady. That includes your Professor Tupper, buddy, and all his goddamn cousins by the dozens. There isn't anyone anywhere that isn't Seymour's fat lady. Don't you know that? Don't you know the goddamn secret yet? And don't you know, listen to me now, don't you know who that fat lady really is? Ah, buddy, it's Christ himself. Christ himself, buddy. And what I love so much about that scene, first of all, when Franny walks to pick up the phone, Salinger says she becomes younger and younger, which I think is beautiful, right? She's coming like a child to receive this wisdom, this like faith that's passed down from her brother. And then after she gets off the phone, it says, for joy, apparently, it was all Franny could do to hold the phone, even with both hands. That passage, it just feels so good. It just feels so beautiful to me. I'd love to know what you think of that passage, whether on its face it is a satisfactory answer to the problems that Franny has, and also whether you think this is something that people might want to think about and listen to today as they go about their vocations.
So, this is my favorite part of the book. And often when I'm teaching this, I always tell the students that it's quite possible that they won't really enjoy the novel or a book until the very last page. I've read short stories, and maybe it's this way because it was a short story at first, but I've never read a novel like thing that really the very last page makes the entire thing. If you were to delete the last page, it would not be a great novel, but this last page absolutely makes it. Yeah, I mean, so, it's tricky. So what we don't want to do is baptize Salinger. On the other hand, he uses Christ, right? I mean, so there's this weird tension because we know, okay, Salinger's not Christian. He's certainly not Orthodox. He's all over the place religiously, but he does get to some spiritual truth that I think is absolutely right, which is that when we're desiring to act in the world, and we're trying to act with excellence, if we focus on that too much, we will get lost in ourselves and our ego, and we won't do anything. And the only way to get over that is to say that you're acting for someone else. And when you can do that, and when you see that you're by acting for someone else, you're acting for God, you can have peace about it. You know that your task is just to do it with excellence and accept whatever happens. And I think that is beautiful and true because it means that the audience's reaction, she talks earlier about this play where the audience just applauded this actor who was terrible. And she's like, they made me sick to my stomach. This audience does not have any taste, right? And that'll be the case, right? Like sometimes you think, okay, I did this, you're praising me and you shouldn't, because this is actually really bad. Sometimes, very often, I think it's more common today for many people to feel just a deep sense of inadequacy. So I'm given an opportunity to do something, but I feel like I'm not qualified for this. So I just don't even want to try. I just want to be on Franny's couch and just not get up. I'm just going to curl up with a cat. Yeah, the imposter syndrome. Exactly. And what Zooey is saying with Seymour and Buddy behind him is that your duty is to act, and it's to act for God's glory. And so then these questions of are you adequate or not don't matter. Your task is just to do what you can for God. And that's just this huge relief, because now all of a sudden Franny, she's going to have times when she's thinking about her identity or her ego or something like that, but she can seek to do it well for someone else. So also what I think is key here is that it's not an inner purity. Like the focus shifts from inside to outside. So now your task is to focus on how do I love this person with my actions rather than how do I act purely? Because I think, again, as I said earlier, I think sincerity is a trap. You start looking inside yourself and you never find your way out. So that's one thing I think, is that it's incredibly powerful. This is why it's helpful for me, why it's encouraging. I do think it's really interesting, and I think it's worth pausing and considering that Seymour makes it a fat lady, and that Franny imagines someone with cancer on an awful wicker chair listening to the radio full blast all day. So I imagine somebody who's elderly, and so today they'd be watching daytime TV all day, but now she's on her front porch, no AC, and she's just listening to the radio all day. Why does she have to picture someone with cancer? Why does she have to picture someone pathetic? And what does that tell us about actually how she conceives of Christ? Do you have any thoughts?
Well, is it Charles Schultz in Peanuts, or somebody who says, I love humanity, it's mankind I can't stand, or something like that. I forget it. I love humanity, it's people I can't stand, something like that.
Yeah.
And people have criticized Salinger for taking a very kind of sentimental, like, let's just embrace everyone kind of. So there's almost a grotesque notion of like, I'm gonna love this kind of caricature of unlovable humanity, and yet I can't accept chicken soup from my mother. So there has been some critique of, it's too much. It's pathetic.
Yeah.
It's not. And I'm about 10% sympathetic to that interpretation. But I love the glasses too much
I know.
to allow that to be my interpretation. I think that she's imagining, and possibly because they put Seymour on this pedestal of he's such a saint, he's such a otherworldly person who accepts and loves everyone indiscriminately, that perhaps they imagined it must be this sort of pathetic figure. But what I like about what Zoe says is, it's not this one particular person. It's not just the pathetic person, or it's not just the most extreme version of whatever you can think of. It's whoever's there in front of you right now at the moment. I remember talking to somebody once how, in some cases when you look at Christ's teachings, or at the way that the Bible talks about not loving the poor, for example, there's a point at which that becomes easy, and then it's loving the rich that becomes difficult, right? And
Yes.
there's something here, I think, of that indiscriminate love, which again, Zoe sort of critiques Franny for not being in tune with. There's something about that indiscriminate love that shines through here. I think that's how I see it.
Yeah. So I have a slightly different take. I think that example of the loving the rich is exactly right, because I don't think it's a coincidence that it's this lady and not maybe some of the phony people that Zoe has lunch with to talk about TV scripts, right? I'm reminded of David Foster Wallace's commencement address, where he talks about being mindful and choosing to think that the person in line in front of you, he uses the person in line in front of you who's taking forever and is writing a check at the grocery store and is just, whatever. Maybe she's been up like multiple nights in a row with holding the hand of a husband who's dying of cancer. And it's a very powerful idea. And what he's calling us to is a kind of humility and accepting that maybe you do need to show people grace. But the reason that he doesn't quite come out and say, but the implication is that you ought to show people grace because they might be worthy of grace. And that's the kind of dark side to that commencement speech. It's like maybe the person who cuts you off in traffic went through a car accident, or they're rushing their sick child to the hospital. And so there's not an idea of like, maybe you should have grace for somebody who cuts you off in traffic, period. And so I think it's telling, it's interesting to me that Salinger can't quite go all the way. Like, I know he says everyone is Seymour's fat lady. Okay. All right. But you have to visualize someone who you think is lonely, has no children, no one there to love her or take care of her, and she's dying of cancer, and all she has is the radio and your voice. So really what you're saying is like, you're picturing someone who you think to be worthy of your love. So to me, this is one area where Salinger gets so close to this idea of the Imago Dei, right? That we ought to love and respect and have grace for people because they're made in the image of God. But he still ultimately has to come down to some conception of worth, of self-worth. Are you worthy of my grace? At least practically, like at least when they're visualizing it, in order for it to work, they've got to visualize someone who's worthy of their grace.
Sure. I mean, I'll go with you so far on that, but what I'm heartened by is that, the professors are mentioned, the other people. I think there is a grasping towards something broader, right? It's not just the lowly and the poor and the pathetic, but also the highfalutin, the professors, and they move in that world, right? So those are the people they're going to have to come to terms with: professors, script writers, directors, these types of people. And even if that's not where we're all going in our lives, I do think there is something to something that I still find very moving and very powerful about this notion of each person that I encounter throughout whatever it is I'm trying to do, as you say, whatever it is I'm trying to do well and do excellently. Can I receive each person just as the Benedictine monks do? Can I receive each visitor as Christ? Can I receive each student who walks into my office to talk about their paper as Christ? Can I receive each person who interacts with a text that I wrote and emails me about it, whether they liked it or hated it? And that's a challenge that I still take to heart, or on my better days, I try to take to heart, and I appreciate it from this.
And it's such a relief when you start thinking that way, because it gets the focus off of you. So you stop asking, am I being sincere? You just stop thinking about yourself. And which is interesting because, this is just basic psychology. If you want to stop thinking about yourself, you can't tell yourself to stop thinking about yourself, which is kind of what Franny is doing through most of the book. She's trying to force herself to have this pure ego. What you have to do is you have to look out. You have to look toward other people. And Salinger says, he frames it specifically in terms of Christ. And so, I agree. I find it incredibly encouraging and inspiring. And that image of her smiling at the ceiling is just lovely.
Yeah, I was going to say the book ends not with the rote repetition of the prayer, right? But with a relaxing into silence and sleep and rest, where it's no longer about what she can do, but it's about having received this truth. And I wonder, speaking of turning outward, I wonder, Kelsey, if we might have time to turn outward to other people who are here, if anybody else would like to talk about it.
Yeah, I would love that. If anybody wants to jump in, you can either send a question or you can just unmute yourself and start chatting here. I had a question for y'all actually that I'll go with, as y'all were talking about the fat lady piece and all of those implications. As I was reading through the book, I remember I got to the point where Zoe, I'm on team both of y'all. I don't know. I actually didn't say the name of the book at the beginning, so I was like, hold on, am I saying this right? Like in the moment, I just stopped myself. So I love that y'all both had different options. But when he leaves the living room, right, and Franny is crying and he's telling Bessie, he's going, Mom, hey, she's crying, I don't know why, whatever. And he says to her right before he goes to pick up the phone, and as soon as he said it, I recognized, I was like, I think he said that in the bathroom too. He calls the mom fatty. And as soon as I got to the end of it, I was thinking kind of along the lines of your thing. It was like, if she's thinking of fatty as the fat lady, as a destitute cancer person, is the person that's right in front of him, is his fatty, is the mother, the fat lady. Is there a correlation? Do y'all see that at all as you think?
I can't believe I never noticed that. That's wonderful.
I don't think I noticed that either.
That's great.
I don't know. That was just my thought, because I stopped and I was like, oh my gosh, you can't believe he just said all these mean things, but that's pretty mean.
It is.
And then you get into the next part of it.
The parents are a weird presence in the Glass family stories. Bessie is there. Les, the father, come on, Les. He's barely there. All of the Glass children, by the way, pretty great symbolic names, right? Seymour,
yeah,
Buddy, Waker, the Catholic priest.
Yeah.
quite amazing. But I don't know. I mean, I do wonder, Alan, what you think about the way that they both Franny and Zoe treat their mother, whether that has anything larger to say about how they're meant to sort of make their way through the world of interacting with others.
Well, if they can't love their mother, then they can't love anyone. And one of Salinger's constant struggles, or his character's constant struggles, is how to love people who are broken, who are pathetic, who are phony. Right? That's behind. Okay, how do you love Lane? How do you love these professors? How do you love these people? Because you know, or Salinger seems to have this innate sense that we are called to love one another. He doesn't quite ground this in the Christian tradition, but he has this sense. But he also has very much a sense that people are terrible, that they're awful, that the mom is annoying. He's taking a bath and she breaks in. Okay, so how do you love someone like this? How do you love? And that's part. And Bessie has a great line when she's chastising Zooey, where she says, you know, you can't love people with you can't have such strong feelings. Like you have to love, and he's just like, oh man, she just got me, because this is part of his problem, is that it's very difficult for him to love and to overlook weaknesses or egotism or something like this. And if you're going to live in this world, you have to be able to love people even when they're egotistical, because they're going to be egotistical. So I think a challenge for probably all of Salinger's characters are to love their parents, because the parents are never really great people. And, you know, Bessie is sweet in some ways. She's got that consecrated chicken soup. Les is sweet, but he's also pathetic and not attentive. He comes out and starts playing old show tunes because he's a vaudeville guy. And this is how his daughter's having an existential crisis, and this is the best he could do. So that's why, you know, what you were saying, Kelsey, making that connection is interesting, because you know, if we think about, you know, the fat lady is this archetype, is this symbol of the everyman, the every person. Okay. It makes sense to have the mother connected with that image, right? Because again, if you can't love your mother despite her flaws, then you have no chance of loving anyone else, because good. Yeah, you just don't. And they do, right? And they do. Like they're you know, snarky and mean to her at times, but they love her a lot. They love her a lot.
Yeah.
I'm glad to hear that's what you think, because I thought he was quite mean to her. So that's good. But I do think there's a familiarity there, and she doesn't seem to take that personally. I do love the description of where her Bessie's face could mean one of two things. Either one of her sons has just called on the phone, or she's received a report that for the next week, the bowels of everyone on earth will move with regularity.
Salinger comes up with these sentences where it's where I'm just like, how? What is that? What does that even mean?
Yeah.
But it's perfect.
Felt like watching Billions in that moment. I don't know if y'all watched any of that.
No,
Sometimes. What does that mean? Okay, any other questions or comments? We'd love to hear from anybody else. Jump on in. No one bites, promise. No.
I had a comment. It hasn't kind of formed into a question yet, but maybe there's something interesting. So I read this book last year and I was like still in college, and so it was very interesting for me to like read all that stuff like while I was like kind of in it, and I was like, oh, this is like definitely me and probably everybody else in like all my English classes, because I was a literature and writing major, so it was all very much familiar. But I think I'm looking at what I wrote when I first read it, and I didn't understand it because I read it outside of class, and I noted that it seemed to be satire, which I thought was really interesting, because now as I'm listening to the discussion, it seems like it wasn't satire at all. So I guess like I feel like that says a lot about like commentary and like the internet age and what it means to like take people seriously, because there's a lot of like self-deprecation that happens on the internet, like especially like on Twitter and TikTok and stuff. So yeah, I don't know how to phrase the question, but I guess like what is it like to read this maybe for your students and like from a 21st century perspective of like her all the rants and stuff, I think seem to me like very indulgent and overindulgent. So yeah, I feel like there's something there, but I don't know how to phrase the
I
question.
think so. No, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think
Yeah.
Salinger's characters they're snappy, they're sarcastic, they're sort of hyper modern for their era, even, right? They're not these mystical sort of seekers who renounce the world, but they also take all this stuff really seriously. And I think that's when I think about whenever I get on like Twitter or social media and stuff, yeah, it's all kind of surface level jokes and dunking on people and put downs, but like there's kind of a real hunger for something behind it all, something real and true. And I think that shines through in this. I don't know what you think, Alan, but
Yeah, it's so one of the things we didn't get too into is how there are so many layers of acting and the anxiety that you're acting even when you don't want to be acting. And so in some of those dialogues, I think probably the reason you thought that they were satirical is that Zooey sometimes slips into satire, and Franny will call him, you know, she could tell like he's playing a character. And so it's fascinating that when he calls her on the phone, he's playing a character. And she finally sees through that and hears his real voice. But even then, as Joel, you were saying, like he's channeling Zooey. So, I mean, Seymour. So you wonder, like, is there ever, but that's why the ending is so powerful, because what it suggests is you don't have to ask those questions. Like, am I being phony right now or am I acting right now? Because if you start asking those questions, you're franning on the couch and you can't get up and you're just curled up with the cat with fleas. I think she has fleas. It has fleas, right? As this is painful. I'm itching just hearing about this. You don't have to ask those questions. And you can just say like, all right, I am doing this to love God. And I don't need to ask, am I being sincere enough? Because that sincerity thing is a trap. How do you know when you're acting and when you're just trying to choose the right words? And there are so many layers of this. It's interesting because Zooey reads a script, and in the script, it's this overwritten, ridiculous script. And one of the characters, the female characters, steals a line from A Farewell to Arms. And then the male character calls it. He's like, that's A Farewell to Arms. You just quoted Ernest Hemingway. And so here we are, we're reading a book, a fictional book, and there's this fictional play in which a character is acting fictionally, right? Playing on this. So there are all these layers of acting and pretending. And you can get lost in it and feel like you have the fear is that there's nothing real inside, right? Like if you peel all these characters back, there's no one there. And Salinger's response is, don't ask that question. That's not the question that matters. The question that matters is, are you acting to love your neighbor, treating them as Christ? If yes, you're doing what you're supposed to be doing. Stop looking in.
I think of what Buddy remembers Seymour saying to him, what he's going to be asked sort of on Judgment Day. He says, he kind of uses this metaphor. He says, were most of your stars out? In other words, were you sort of fully sort of alive to the possibilities of life? And were you busy writing your heart out? In other words, did you throw yourself into your vocation? And because he says that will be sort of what he's asked as judgment, you know, the implication is your sort of God-given vocation. Which I think is beautiful.
Yeah, I agree.
All right, we have a question or comment here. Would be interested in any other non-Christian authors or works discussing a spiritual crisis like this. That is fascinating. Thank you, Michelle. Alan, what do you think? Is there other literature that kind of looks at similar problems?
Yeah, so around the same time, Sylvia Plath, The Bell Jar, deals with this a very similar crisis of identity. Another college student who feels this overwhelming burden of having to be successful in a certain kind of way. and she has to come to terms with that. It's much darker, and I think Salinger's ending is much more Christian than Plath. So I think Plath's ending is phony. To be honest, I think I think that the ending of her novel does not fit with the rest of the truth of the rest of the novel, but that's for another time. But what she does do, Plath, even better than Salinger, I think, gets at this deep sense of existential crisis that a young person can feel as they're facing the challenge of living in the adult world and the pressure to have a career and be successful and be somebody and all these sorts of things. It's beautiful and funny. It's really funny. It's much funnier than Salinger. It's also much darker because
Darker, I was going to say, yeah, I found it quite disturbing when I read it in high school. Yeah.
it's funny. You read it again. It's so funny. It's so funny. It's really good.
I think there's something of the your mention of David Foster Wallace strikes me as quite. I don't want to say that he is a disciple of Salinger in any way, but I think he borrows a lot of, not borrows. I think a lot of his concerns and a lot of the way he writes these sort of self-consciously clever sentences and kind of in the span of a few pages can sort of be very sincere and very surfacey at the same time. I think he has a lot of kinship with the way Salinger treats these big questions. Although, I mean, Wallace is a much bigger kettle of fish in some ways to deal with, but I think that's a great one to dive into about kind of our, sort of the modern person's crisis of being torn between sort of what's in front of us immediately and a deeper spiritual walk. So.
Yeah. So the Kenyon College commencement speech titled "This Is Water" is, if you haven't read or listened to that, that's fantastic. And as I say, I think it resonates a lot. Yeah. So there's like a spiritual kinship that they both have. It's interesting because there's not this direct allusion or anything, but boy, it feels like if they were at a party, they would be hanging out together, because actually that would be a terrible party. They're both weird.
I'm going to invite one more person to that terrible party, and that's the writer David James Duncan. I think that his novel, The Brothers K, I don't know if you've read that.
Oh, I haven't. No.
Oh my gosh.
I have it on my shelf.
Read it.
I'm bitter because I don't want to say Karamazov. I want to say The Brothers K, and everyone who hears me say that knows that I'm referring to Dostoevsky. But I can't say that because of this dude. So I haven't read it. It's on my shelf.
Your turn to have your head, to have somebody shake their head.
I know. Is it really though?
We're going to end with you.
Really?
Yeah,
go ahead.
It's an incredible book. I return to it in the same way I return to Franny and Zoe. I read it.
Oh man, now I've got to read it.
It is a gorgeous, sprawling family story of spiritual seeking, of betrayal and forgiveness, of repentance and reconciliation. It is a gorgeous, gorgeous book. So if you have not read The Brothers K by David James Duncan, I heartily recommend that to you. If you like Franny and Zoe, you'll love it. It's not just for you, Alan, it's for everybody. Do take your time. You're busy, but
all right,
it's a lovely, lovely book.
Okay, I'll do it. I'm gonna have to give up my long health for decades, or at least a decade. I've been putting this off. It's on my shelf, and I've been like,
no. I've never read The Brothers Karamazov. I only read part of it.
Get out of here. This is over.
And
The Brothers Karamazov is amazing. That's a real good book. And you know what? It's the original. It's the original Brothers K, not this knockoff riding Dostoevsky's coattails.
Well, I think we've reached the end of our time here.
I'm gonna write a book called Moby D, and that's, we'll just say,
Catcher in the R.
Catcher in the R. Yeah.
Okay, well, if anybody has any more questions, throw it out now. Forever hold your peace. Yeah, no? Okay, well, thank y'all so much for coming. Thank you so much, Alan and Joel. That was awesome. I really enjoyed it. There's multiple things in there I'm going to be thinking about for a long time. And thank you everyone for showing up tonight and giving us just a little over an hour of your evening. Hopefully I think that everybody's probably going to be rereading the same book tonight. All of us, same moon, same book, same thing. It's great. Thank y'all for coming. We appreciate it.
Thanks,
All right.
everybody. Take care.
Bye.